Zero Hour. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and with us now, it's our great pleasure to welcome Rick Perlstein, who is an American historian, a journalist, a writer. He's written for The Village Voice, The New Republic, Mother Jones and the Nation. Years ago, he was a senior fellow and writer with the Campaign for America's Future, which is the other hat I also wear as well. He has written a lot of very important history books recently, including Before the Storm, Barry Goldwater and the Unmaking of the American Consensus, Nixon Land, The Rise of a President and the Fracturing of America, and most recently, The Invisible Bridge, The Fall of Nixon and the Rise of Reagan, which is going to be our primary topic today. Rick, thanks so much for joining us.
You forgot to mention friend, RJ.
I assumed that was obvious, but absolutely, friend. And we're delighted to have you. And Rick, I wanted to start with a quick anecdote just to set up why I've been so impressed with The Invisible Bridge. I'm sadly old enough to remember the fall of Nixon and the rise of Reagan, although I was a kid. But, you know, to some of us, that's like the fall of Dr. Doom and the rise of Galactus or something. But I think your book takes a very neutral tone, and despite that, a very objective authorly tone. Despite that, has set up a bit of a firestorm, which we may get to. But the anecdote I wanted to tell you is this: in 1988, as the Reagan presidency was coming to an end, and I was a young corporate executive of all things, I was sitting in a hotel room watching reruns of a program called Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In, which you're no doubt aware of. And that was in 1968, supposed to capitalize. There was a couple Las Vegas comedians trying to capitalize on the counterculture with a kind of hippie-ish
I've always wondered
vibe.
who Rowan and Martin were, actually.
They were Las Vegas strip comedians, basically. They were Rat Pack wannabes. And and their bit was going to be, hey, we'll do the hippies. We'll do the hippies on TV.
It was kind of like the monkeys of comedy.
Yeah, very much so. And so their show was a big hit. And they used to have a bit every week called The News 20 Years from Today. And it would be gag news about the wacky things America's going to be doing 20 years from today. And so this show was made when Ronald Reagan was first running for governor of California, and people thought that was a joke. He was a has-been. He was a nobody. He had been the host of Borax Theater or one of those things, a TV show where he'd advertise 20 Mule Team Borax. I mean, he was a nobody and a laugh line. And when the News of the Future bit began, he opened with the line, and in news from 20 years from today, President Ronald Reagan announced, and then cue the laugh track.
In other words, kidding me. I am so mad at you, RJ. Why did you not tell me about this? I could have put that in the book. I got to put it in my next book. It's great.
Isn't it amazing? So there I was in 1988 realizing, watching the tributes to this so-called wonderful president, certainly transformative president in many ways, and wondering to myself, how in 20 years did this man go from being a punchline, even for Vegas comedians, to the historical figure he became? And a lot of the answer to that, in my opinion, is in your book, The Invisible Bridge. And I wanted to talk to you about that. The sense I get reading your book is that more than anything else, Reagan became Reagan because of, first of all, as you say, we suffered more wounds. This is you writing. Between 1973 and 1976, America suffered more wounds to its ideal of itself than at just about any other time in history, meaning the withdrawal from Vietnam, Watergate, Nixon resignation, and so on. With these traumas emerged a new sort of American politics, a stark discourse of reckoning. And then in comes Reagan with no doubt, no question, no hesitation, telling a narrative of purity and idealism that resonated. And where the hell did this guy come from?
Right. I mean, people who've read my previous books, know I put some stock in kind of psychology and understanding history. And it's not even just really the psychology of the guy who becomes the president, even though that's interesting enough. It's not psychobiography. What's really interesting is when sort of a leader's deepest, or an aspirant for leadership, deepest psychological drives resonate with the collective longings of the mass public, right? And that's what's happening with Reagan. That's what happened with Nixon. I think his kind of sadism and his sense that the whole world was out to get him, and that liberals were snobs and they were out-of-touch bureaucrats. This is the Franklin Orthogonian thing I write about in Nixonland, is a big part of his appeal. Reagan comes from a chaotic family. His dad's an alcoholic. He's basically a failed shoe salesman, bad enough to be a shoe salesman, but a failed shoe salesman, right? And right. He's always moving the family from town to town, probably, one step ahead of the law. It's prohibition. He could be showing up in the newspaper any day. The reason I'm convinced that he hasn't turned up in the Dixon Telegraph for a drunkenness arrest was because he was a pinnacle partner of the sheriff. And his mom, what she contributes to this is she's kind of a do-gooder and a martyr. And she's constantly kind of like on the road around the region, helping people in need, which is noble enough. But she's also, kind of reading the Bible to prisoners and playing her mandolin for the prisoners. I think she had a mandolin and a banjo. And she was so kind of respected as a kind of someone said she was a faith healer too, actually. She was so kind of respected for doing this in the community that prisoners were, kind of after finishing their sentences would literally be remanded to her custody and stay in the family sewing room. But while they're staying in the family sewing room, Reagan and his brother are sleeping two to a bed. And there's this great line I quote in the book about, just what kind of weird family was this where you have this kind of fundamentalist mom, this kind of Catholic drunk dad, you have these succession of prisoners coming in and out, and what was it like for a kid to grow up in that situation? If you look at the pictures of Reagan when he was there are not many of them, but when he was kind of 7, 8, 9, no one knew he was going to be great, so, there wasn't a lot of photography, and of course he was not a rich kid. He looks like what he really was, which was kind of a lost, scared kid. Mm. But if you look at the pictures of him after that, you can't find a single one in which he doesn't have that kind of sense of inner grace that we associate with Ronald Reagan. Always aware of the camera, always kind of posing, but always sort of looking confident, solid, someone you'd want to follow into battle, right? And so what happened in the interim? What's that, RJ? What were we going to say?
Well, what I was going to say was the cheap interpretation would be that but possibly with some validity, would be that, here you had a nation that was undergoing its own trauma for years, in the years leading up to Reagan's election. I mean, you quoted a headline about, I think, the return of the POWs. Nation's hunger to feel good erupts in fever of patriotism. One of the great quotes. People don't realize.
Is cheap, RJ?
No, I'm saying my interpretation is cheap, and I was going to.
Too. Basically, it's basically there's this, what he's providing to. So what he comes out of, kind of basically reading, boys' adventure books and kind of identifying with sports heroes is this kind of inner transformation in which he kind of makes himself the hero of his own adventure story and a rescuer. And that's kind of the role he's cast himself in everywhere, and he's really, really, really good at it. And of course, ever since the beginning, some people think he's a phony and some people think he's a hero, right? But, when you get to the 70s, when some people think he's a phony and some people think he's a hero, his ability to kind of, sort of address what's going on, the chaos, but respond with this stout-hearted certainty that it's not really chaotic at all. Other people might think it's chaotic, but actually he sees this crystalline moral clarity. And how you manage to do that, in the face of something like the Vietnam War, I mean, that's some pretty virtuoso stuff.
Well, and, it certainly is. And he morphed a little bit. I mean, I think when he was governor, for example, I remember him being extremely nasty about student demonstrators and poor people. So he had this nasty streak, but he had this sunniness. So I guess what I wanted to ask you about as a historian,
Hmm.
you have what used to be called in the, before feminism, the great man theory of history that
Right.
says, one transformative figure, and you talk about this, one transformative figure comes along. Then you have a theory that says, no, the individuals don't matter. It's the shifting tides of history. But I think it feels as if one of your conclusions, I don't want to speak for you, but one of the conclusions to be drawn from The Invisible Bridge in the Reagan story is that it's a co-authorship between
Right.
the talented individual and history or
That's right.
society.
That's
Is that fair?
absolutely. The great leader kind of rides sort of the tide of the interchange of the electorate, right? And there's this guy actually who writes a lot about this. There's a whole very dense and very thoughtful book called Leadership by this guy John McGregor Burns, who just died about a month ago. He was a FDR biographer, this great political scientist, right? And we could spend a lot of time sitting around a dinner table theorizing about Barack Obama's rise in exactly the same way. This guy who can kind of reconcile and unite all opposites. Who can, who's kind of palpable longing for kind of stability and safety and security in this kind of fatherless, kind of strange, cosmopolitan, multicultural upbringing. Kind of heals the wounds of a country that just feels too divided for words. Right? It's a good way to think about history, and obviously, if it's not abused. But really, it's just, the foundation for kind of telling a story about how social change happens. And you can watch it happening. You
Right.
can watch debates. Yeah.
And that's something that I want to get into a little. We're going to take a quick break if that's okay, but that's something I want to get into a little bit more, and maybe a little bit about why pundits got it so wrong at the time, which is something that you talk about in The Invisible Bridge. So we will be right back after this break. We're talking with historian and author Rick Perlstein about his new book, The Invisible Bridge: The Fall of Nixon and the Rise of Reagan. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and we'll be right back after this. And we are back on the Zero Hour. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and we're speaking with Rick Perlstein, historian, journalist, and author of the new book, The Invisible Bridge: The Fall of Nixon and the Rise of Reagan. And I wanted to ask you, Rick, we've been talking about how, in the last segment, we talked about how Ronald Reagan kind of captured a moment, a zeitgeist. And, it's important to remember that societies aren't homogenous, and there were a lot of people who didn't feel the Reagan magic. Myself among them at the time. But I wanted to talk a little bit about punditry, because you write a central theme of my previous two books, chronicling conservatism's ascendancy in American politics, has been the myopia of pundits who so frequently fail to notice the very cultural ground shifting beneath their feet. Now, pundits made fun of Ronald Reagan, I would say. People may not like this, but I would consider Reagan a living embodiment of that liberal aphorism, that quote that gets attributed to various folks about first they make fun of you and then they ignore you and then you win, or whatever it is. I mean, they made fun of Reagan and ignored him and dismissed him for years, didn't they?
Unfortunately. Yeah, absolutely. RJ, I'm on a book tour and I've been doing so many interviews. Did I tell you the story about Lassie? Oh, yeah, no, I didn't. That was another interview. When he ran for governor in 1966 and he won the nomination, Esquire said, "Well, the Republican Party in California is not that hard up. They didn't nominate Liberace." Right.
Right.
I mean, this is a guy who was, who co-starred with a chimp. This is hilarious, right? And like you said, like the laugh-in thing. Actually, this is a true story. Someone told me that she was working at a nursing home and someone had dementia, and they told her that Ronald Reagan was president, and she couldn't stop laughing. And she was like, her head was in, whatever it was, 1948, and she thought that was the most hilarious thing she'd ever heard. So it comes naturally, but so they're always dismissing him, and kind of fast forwarding to 1980, the Carter administration's strategy is to get Ronald Reagan into a debate, because they know if the president of the United States and this extremist actor just kind of stand side by side, Reagan will look like a fool. He'll say something crazy or stupid. He'll say we begin bombing in 5 minutes or whatever, and then I've talked to Carter speechwriters, and they're like, we just knew, we'd done the opposition research. Once we hit him with this, he had, said that, Medicare was going to turn us all into slaves of the federal government. How could he possibly win? So even the smartest and most sophisticated people at the highest level of the game are playing this. And you know what happened? I mean, they had a debate on October 27th, 1980, the week before the election, and Reagan didn't drool. And when he was hit with this line that was supposed to be the haymaker about him, saying that Medicare was going to turn us all into slaves of the government, he had all through the debate hit Carter for supposedly distorting his record, and he just kind of giggled. He kind of smirked. He can smirk. Smirk would look ugly. He giggled. He looked at the audience and said, "There you go again." And the audience laughed in sympathy with him, and it was just, Carter was completely caught flat-footed. No one seemed to figure out that you never underestimate this guy, because he'll always smack you in the end.
Well, wasn't that also the debate where they had somehow acquired, perhaps with quotation marks around the word acquired, Carter's debating book and knew what he was going to go for?
Well, there you go again. Another liberal insisting that it must be some trick that Ronald Reagan was able to, beat anybody. Yeah, that happened. George Will was
there you go
again, right?
Yeah.
But look, he didn't need it. He didn't need a like a secret kind of briefing book about Carter to win a debate. He was winning. He beat it. Go on YouTube and check out the debate he did with RFK in 1967. He kicked his butt.
Really?
This guy is really fast on his feet and verbally fluid, but it's also that blitheness, that ability to kind of reduce complexities into incredibly witty sound bites. That it's catnip. It's remarkable.
Well, and there's another piece of Reagan too that I think is very interesting, which is, and you're a musician, I'm a musician, which is his tone of voice was so brilliantly modulated that he could say outrageous things, but he would say them, well, that's just the way it is. And you just thought, well, I'm just talking to a regular, plain-speaking guy, not one of these politicians. So when he tells me Medicare has made a slave of me, well, I just can't help it. There was something so soothing about the way he would intonate the madness, right?
Yeah.
So
and apparently he got his tone of voice from studying his mother, who was apparently very effective rhetorician in church. Yeah.
And I as someone who plays mandolin and a little banjo, they're not my main instruments, but I'd be very, very, and collects old songs. I'd be very curious. I'd love to know her repertoire.
Well, I know she did some dialect comedy. Seriously.
Oh boy.
And there's what is the story? It's in the book somewhere, or maybe I didn't put it in the book, but there's like a famous kind of Yiddish dialect story about something at Sadie at the wedding or something like that, and it's famous. There's a record of it, and it's actually found it on YouTube, and I think I put it on Facebook once. But that's the kind of stuff, it was like Boardwalk Empire. It was like the popular culture of the 20s. I'm sure that that was what was in the air. It was kind of the great era of mass culture, right? Be fascinating.
Right, and probably some Stephen Foster and all of that stuff too.
Mm-hmm. And he could tell dialect stories too. Robert Novak, on a plane trip with him in 1976, that he told kind of like he did like perfect ethnic dialect and said, my aides won't let me do this in public.
That was good advice.
Yeah, right.
Well, listen, again, I want to let the audience know that The Invisible Bridge by Rick Perlstein, it's such a terrific book. I mean, it's so well written. There's so much in there. I think it's so clear. But originally, when we booked you for the show, I was going to ask you more about this, these claims being made against you, this absurd perjury and all that from a Republican hack. But that's already imploded. I'm sorry, not perjury. Plagiarism.
I mean, they might have me, kidnapping the Lindenberg baby next. Who knows?
Forgive me for conflating those two words, but I just finished a piece about Wall Street, so it was an understandable mistake. So forgive me. But plagiarism, which was just a ridiculous charge, and I was going to ask you more about it, but it's already in 48 hours imploded and fallen apart. But so the real question is not the substance of this silly, accusation for whatever he is, Ann Coulter's flack or whatever he does for a living. But the real question is, why do you think this book has touched such a nerve? I mean, Nixon Land, a couple conservatives, I don't know if it was William, who it was, George F. Will or somebody, thought it was a good book. It was because you're a historian, right? So you should be able to respect the telling of history. But something about this book, The Fall of Nixon and Rise of Reagan, it's touched off a nerve, and they really wanted to discredit it before it even got into the bookstores, and maybe prevent it from getting into the bookstores. Why do you think that is?
Well, I mean, the question answers itself. I mean, he really is a larger-than-life god to these guys. And, I think that the guy who's plagiarizing me, Craig Shirley, accusing me of plagiarism, he's a good historian, and his book is good, which is why I cited it 125 times. I like to say, he wants my book pulped, I want his book read. I'm trying to start a conversation, he's trying to stop a conversation. But, he's not, there are flaws in his book, and he kind of passes off some mythology as fact, right? And there's this really great example to kind of give away the end of the book. Reagan gives this very famous speech in the 1976 convention. Ford wins. It's close. But Ford, at the end, kind of, after he gives his acceptance speech, kind of calls up to Ronald Reagan, who's in the rafters, and begs him to come down and say a few words. Reagan kind of shakes his head, no, and says, this is, Ford's movement. And he looks really, really reluctant. Finally, he accedes to the cheers of the crowd, and he makes his way down to the stage, and he supposedly tells an aide, I have no idea what I'm going to say, and gives this amazing address that basically has the delegates crying, and, once again saying, well, maybe we nominated the wrong guy. Now, Craig Shirley takes this story at face value, but both of us read, and I know this because Shirley, and when we were kind of having cordial conversations on the phone, both of us read, and he claims to have enjoyed a 1977 book that completely debunks that story and proves that the Reagan and the Ford forces had kind of negotiated every aspect of that script. And in his interview with Dave Weigel in Slate, as an example of why I'm a bad historian, he says, how can he, say that, this was not spontaneous? If you watch the video on YouTube, you can see him shaking his head that he doesn't want to do it.
Oh, well, then it must be.
So he can't even, sort of wrap his mind around the fact that Reagan was, a skilled actor, and might even say it ain't so, have attempted a little bit of subterfuge here and again.
So, or perhaps theater. And by the way, I think his reaction to losing his legs in King's Row was also completely authentic. So we've got this character rising on it. So I guess just to close off the punditry and the pushback piece on it. So basically, they really need Reagan to be this magical figure, this transformative.
Even though he wasn't all that popular when he was president.
Nor, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, but nor I think was he the most popular ex-president when he and Bill Clinton were both former presidents.
Well, probably Jimmy Carter's the most popular ex-president. That's a different story altogether. Yeah.
And I guess my only point in saying that is that, this is how I'm going to circle back to the media, but the media have been, I think, very complicit in this sense, particularly at the time of Reagan's funeral and so on, that Reagan was the most popular president in modern history, that he was considered an iconic figure after his presidency and on the mold of FDR, when really he was not that popular as a president, and a lot of people didn't think much of him when he was a former president. Is that fair? Isn't that
figure? I mean, the truth. It's like you can interpret anything about the president, whether it was good or bad, right? And I accept that, but it's simply a fact of history that Reagan is a very divisive figure. And even, Edmund Morris. I mean, I thought, on the book tour, I thought I'd be talking a lot about Edmund Morris, but people seem to have forgotten him. Edmund Morris treats him like everyone loved him, and he was this beloved great guy,
Edmund Morris, of course, who wrote the famous, his book was Dutch, right?
Dutch, the one where he, proudly made stuff up.
Right. It was he had been reading too much. Who are the guys who did the original new journalism, fictionalizing,
Right,
and
Ronald
so
Reagan.
he, yeah. So he was doing a lot of mythological or
He
fictionalized
wrote himself into the
conversation.
story and pretended that he had gone to school with Ronald Reagan, and yeah, it was fictionalized. It's weird.
Yeah, yeah, it was weird, and I think that was the reason why people couldn't embrace it. But how was his research? Was it any good?
Mm. In some ways, it was good. In some ways, it was bad. But he kind of broke faith with the reader, and that one of the things I'm really proud of is I quote these interviews a guy did in 1966 that he sent me with Reagan's college classmates, and I was like, have people used these before? This is amazing. And one of the things I show is that kind of Reagan divided friend and foe in exactly the same way when he was in college that he does now. And the guy
Talk
said,
about
well,
that. Go ahead.
Well, just a sec. Edmund Morris, he said, they're in Edmund Morris's book, but if you look at the footnotes, you can't tell whether he's making it up or not. So, I mean, it's like, there's a really, my favorite piece of fictionalized history, or kind of halfway between fictionalized history and historical novel writing, is a really good book about the Soviet Union called Red Plenty. But the author of that, Anthony Spooford, his footnotes are very explicit about what he makes up and what he doesn't make up. So that didn't happen with Edmund Morris, and I think that's a little nuts. It's pretty unacceptable.
Well, maybe he wanted to make himself an elusive figure so that he couldn't be pinned down and attacked by anybody. Maybe it was
Actually,
an
that's
escape.
exactly what I argued in a Newsweek essay. That basically,
Oh, really?
the character Edmund Morris is a racist, who called James Baldwin a frail little fag. Is Edmund Morris a racist? I don't know.
Right. Well. See, that's a cheap. My personal estimation, that's a cheap trick. Say what's on your mind, and don't put it in a fictional character's mouth, even yourself. If you believe it, say it. If you don't, don't. But what do I know? So we've got. But let's go back to this about Reagan being. I remember this from the book, but let's just talk about that for a second. About Reagan being a divisive figure, even in his college years. Well, describe that if you don't mind.
Right. So I have, these interviews done by the guy, the writer, by the way, his name's Paul Keyes, Keyes. Really good writer that writers who are listening to the show should check out. He wrote a great book called The Courage to Write. That's the book about writer's block, actually. It's really fantastic. And so when he was a kind of a young journalist, he wanted to do an article for Esquire about Ronald Reagan, a profile of him in college, and he did tons of research, handed over all his files, which was amazing, very generous. And these interviews, these typed-up interviews, typed up on his, his 1966 typewriter, with a dozen people, including, people who were teachers at Eureka College and classmates of his. And it's fascinating. They almost kind of divide down the middle. Half are like, oh, I knew he would add up to great things, and he was such a leader, and he was so charismatic, and he was so charming, and he was so wonderful, and, I'd follow him anywhere. And half were like, this guy's just a giant phony. And, one of them says, I read his memoir in which he describes the student strike we had at Eureka, and it doesn't even feel like we went to the same school. So, some people think he's a hero and some people think he's a phony. Isn't that pretty much how it is now?
Yeah, I think it is. And by the way, a lot of people don't remember, but in the 1976 primary election, Gerald Ford said, Ronald Reagan doesn't dye his hair, he's just prematurely orange.
Yeah, that was at the Gridiron dinner. He had hired a joke writer because people didn't think he was funny enough.
It was a good line.
Good line, yeah.
But now, going forward, I guess, so we've got, and by the way, I met Nancy Reagan, I've met Reagan's daughter, bright people, compelling people, this is a guy, and I think it comes across in your book, it's not that this guy has no substance. I mean, he has considerable substance, he has considerable intelligence, he has enormous gifts. I think you portray all of that in this book, and I guess I just want to bring us around to the title, The Invisible Bridge. I think it comes from a quote, I think if I recall correctly, from Churchill, about an
interesting misrecollection of yours, RJ. It comes from Nikita Khrushchev.
Well, fat bald guys who ran countries. Yeah. That's how it got filed.
He gave, of all things, he gave Richard Nixon political advice. He said, if the people think that there's an imaginary river out there, don't tell them it's not there. Build an imaginary bridge.
Which A, is a brilliant quote, whichever uh, fat guy running a country said it, number one. Number two, a perfect metaphor, in my opinion, for the Reagan rise, because there was a mythology based on fear that we were losing the America we had. And we, in this case, I would argue, meaning white people, were losing the mythical America that certainly wasn't the America of Reagan's childhood.
There you go again.
There you go again. And so, was that your thinking as we wrap up in choosing that title, The Invisible Bridge? Or
yeah. It was basically like this was a guy who was really great at creating mythology and taught us to kind of dwell in mythology. And, my concluding thought would be, he's the guy who's responsible for this kind of every politician have to make this ritual announcement that America is the greatest country in the world and can do no wrong and can make no mistakes. And these Republicans running around saying Democrats don't believe in American exceptionalism. And, Samantha Power, in her, confirmation hearing to be UN ambassador when she was asked, what sins she identifies in the American past by Marco Rubio says, America is the greatest country in the world and we have nothing to apologize for. That kind of nonsense that keeps us from kind of looking our past straight in the face and looking at the problems of our present and fixing them, that comes out of Reagan, and that actually probably had as big an effect on the country as any, regressive tax cut or hike he ever made.
And perhaps even bigger, but, as Nikita Khrushchev said, we will fight them on the seas, we will fight them. No, wrong, that was Churchill. Listen, Rick Perlstein.
I'm banging my platform shoes on the desk here.
Rick Perlstein, historian, journalist, author of The Invisible Bridge, The Fall of Nixon and the Rise of Reagan, a terrific book that I strongly recommend everyone read. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Richard. Goodbye.
Bye. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and we will be right back after this on the Zero Hour.